now we have a problem. If we want to deal with inflation, we need to slow down the economy. To slow down the economy, we're going to end up causing unemployment, right? You slow down demand, producers don't need as many workers, we've got a problem. A New Zealand-born economist by the name of Phillips looked at the relationship between unemployment, and he started out by looking at the rate of change of wages, which gets interpreted as the rate of inflation. And what Phillips found was there's this negative relationship, and we're seeing that negative relationship with these downward sloping curves. These are each Phillips curves. And so this negative relationship means that we are kind of like on a seesaw. If inflation is high, unemployment is low. If unemployment is high, inflation will be low. So they move in opposite directions. So let's see what happens. Along this short-run Phillips curve, and these are all short-run curves. We'll look at the long run in a minute. Along this short-run Phillips curve, what we see happening is, let's say we start at an unemployment rate of 8%. And the government says, oh, that's way too high. We want to stimulate the economy to get people back to work. So they begin spending more money. Consumers get more money, they spend more, etc. So, and we know that more spending causes more demand. More demand causes producers to want to produce more. And as demand for goods increases, consumers are spending, and so producers are going to want to hire more workers. So we see unemployment dropping from 8% to 7% to 6% to 5%. But the problem is, as we hire more workers, as there's more demand, demand increases faster than supply, and guess what? We end up with unemployment at 5%, but what's happened to inflation? It's gone up. We've pushed it up, that almost demand pull inflation kind of a thing. And so as the government, when we're trying to push down inflation, right, this moves in the opposite direction. If we want to contract the economy to lower inflation from 7% to 4%, we are going to move along this Phillips curve and move down from the 7% inflation and 5% unemployment. We're going to slide down this Phillips curve. Yeah, we're going to get 4% inflation, but we're going to get 8% unemployment. Okay? So we need to be careful of this. We need to be aware of this. How much contraction of the economy do we need to do to get rid of the inflation? And are we willing to deal with the unemployment that occurs with it? Now, another thing, in the 1970s, an American economist by the name of Milton Friedman, we've talked about Friedman before, we're going to talk about him again, but Friedman looked at this relationship here and goes, keep in mind something, that along these curves, there's a certain level of expected inflation that's going on. And so what happens if our expectations of inflation increase? And that's what you're seeing here with these different levels of the Phillips curve, the short run Phillips curve. they each represent different levels of expected inflation. So if at 8% unemployment we expect a certain inflation rate, we'd be at this, say, an inflation rate of 5%. We'd be here. But if we all of a sudden expect more inflation at the same level of unemployment, we'd be at a higher Phillips curve. Now, what Friedman, his contribution to this whole discussion about the relationship between inflation and unemployment was he argued that in the long run, the Phillips curve would be vertical. Now, this slide looks a little messy. I meant this to be this way. So don't think I'm a really messy drawer, which I am. All right. At this point here, if we had 0% inflation, and that's what being right at this curve means, at 0% inflation, we would still have a certain level of unemployment. And that is what we call our natural rate of unemployment. We looked at that before. The natural rate of unemployment is the unemployment level around which the economy fluctuates. It's also sometimes called our full employment level. Now, if we are here on this short-run Phillips curve, what Friedman argued was that attempts to move us lower than this are going to cause people to expect higher inflation. So instead of us moving lower, getting a lower unemployment, all we're going to see is an increase in inflation. And any attempt to move beyond this is just going to cause inflation, that there's not going to be that negative relationship anymore. And so for Friedman, the Phillips curve in the long run would be vertical. And it's vertical because we're taking into account people's expectations of inflation. Now, if Friedman's right, we end up with a problem. Another problem. Seems like we've got lots of problems, doesn't it? We have another problem here, and something that we never thought that could occur. We were all comfortable, we economists were comfortable with this negative relationship between unemployment and inflation. But now the long-run Phillips curve being vertical creates a problem, because in the long run we could have high unemployment and high inflation. And that is something that economists for a very long time didn't think could happen. Well, of course, when we think something couldn't happen, it does. We ended up with something that we call stagflation, high inflation and high unemployment. Now, what was happening in the recession of 73 to 75, businesses were facing higher and higher oil prices, and that set off inflation. But consumers weren't spending, businesses weren't spending, because they were afraid of what this could mean. These oil price shocks were set off by a political situation. OPEC was actually boycotting the United States. They weren't going to sell oil to the United States because of the U.S. Backing of Israel during the Yom Kippur War. And so there was a political situation. There was the real possibility that the U.S. was going to go to war. And so people weren't spending money. Businesses were seeing higher and higher input prices. So they started laying people off, and we had stagflation. Now, Remember, we're in this new Keynesian economy where the government is going to intervene in the economy. And so they looked to the Keynesian economists and said, hey, we've got inflation. What do we do to get rid of inflation? Well, you slow down the economy, and that's going to cause high unemployment. And the government said, wait a minute. We already have high unemployment. We need to get rid of the high unemployment. So the Keynesians go, well, sure, you can get rid of unemployment, stimulate the economy. That'll get people back to work. The government looks at the economists and says, wait a minute, we already have high inflation. We don't want to stimulate the economy. The Keynesian economists basically threw up their hands and said, we can't help you. Well, that presented a problem because economists were now in a time when the government was already starting to intervene in the economy. The economists now no longer had a solution. Well, the solution had been there since 1776 and the publication of The Wealth of Nations. Economists said, well, maybe we should let the market do its own thing. And that leads to an issue. Do we have a Keynesian economy where the government intervenes in the economy, or do we have a laissez-faire economy where the government doesn't intervene? Well, that's what we have to turn to look at next.